Snow hammered the Appalachian Mountains when Earl Johnson, a lonely farmer, heard strange thuds outside his cabin. Expecting falling branches, he opened the door and froze. A massive white horse stood in the storm, two fragile foals pressed at her side. She looked at him, not like an animal, but like a messenger begging for shelter. Earl had no idea that letting them in would rewrite everything he believed about loss, love, and survival. Snow had a way of making silence louder in the Appalachian hills. It filled every hollow and swallowed every road sign, laid itself over the field stubble like a white sheet pulled up over a sleeping body. Earl Johnson watched it drift past his window in steady, slanted bands, each gust pressing against the old glass until it trembled in the frame. The wind sounded like a long memory trying to get in. He stood in wool socks on a floor that leaned a little to the east, the boards worn smooth, where his boots had traveled the same paths for decades, from stove to sink, sink to woodbox, woodbox back to the stove. The cabin had once been a tidy square of pine and promise, a place he and Ruth had painted the color of wheat under a July Sunday time. Smoke and winters had browned it to the shade of old tobacco. Every seam showed. The chinking between logs had cracked, then been patched, then cracked again, like a smile that could no longer quite hold. On the wire rack by the stove, 2 slices of cornbread warmed beside a dented pot of beans. The air held the dry, mineral smell of wood ash and the faint sweetness of sorghum from the jar. He rationed with a strictness he hadn't applied to anything since the bank had taken the last of his good cattle. Outside, the wind shouldered the chimney, and the stove answered with a low iron hum, as if the two were in an argument the stove intended to win. Earl spooned beans into a bowl and sat at the small table where the varnish had bubbled from years of hot plates and cold winters. He ate slowly, the way a man does when he has more time than food. The calendar on the wall still showed November, though it was already deep into December. The photograph was of a sunset over a lake he'd never seen. Ruth used to fuss about keeping the pages turned, as if a fresh picture could bring a fresh start. He'd stopped turning pages the spring after the accident. Some habits disappeared without a ceremony. The window above the sink had a crack that ran from the top right corner to the middle, like a bolt of lightning captured mid-strike. Through it, the snow rendered the hillside into broad strokes of white and gray. He could just make out the black run of the fence line he'd meant to fix in September, and then meant to fix in October, and then meant to fix after the first frost, because men like him were always making deals with the weather and losing. He set the spoon down and felt the familiar tightness behind the breastbone ease in and out like a tide. The doctor in town had called it stress and age, layered atop years of work that would eventually exact their due. The doctor had also said, gently, that loneliness presses on a body the way a storm front does hard, and with a slow, relentless weight. Earl had nodded, because there was nothing in the room he could argue with. Losing Ruth had split the house into 2 nations that shared a border but never crossed. Her yellow mug still hung from the hook by the stove. Her apron, washed and folded the week after the funeral, sat in the bottom of a drawer with the lavender sachet she'd loved tucked beside it. He couldn't bring himself to move these last bright pieces of her. He had learned to live around them the way you learn to live around a stone in the field you were too tired to pull. When the wind shifted, he caught the green smell it pushed under the door, the sharp tang of ice, the faint resin of pine. It drew a memory up from his bones. Ruth at the sink in early spring, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sunlight scattered in her hair, laughing at something he'd said and telling him he wasn't nearly as funny as he thought. He could see the red rooster weather vane on the shed, turning in the same wind that played in her hair. The memory closed its hand around his chest so gently, he almost mistook it for comfort. He finished the beans, wiped the bowl with the last piece of cornbread, and fed 2 sticks to the stove. The flame took hold greedily and then settled, orange and patient. He checked the pantry, a habit as automatic as breathing. On the shelf, a half bag of flour, a coffee can of oats, 2 jars of tomatoes, 3 jars of green beans, a small tin of salt, and a jar of sorghum with a line drawn in grease pencil to mark how far it could go this month. He had counted and recounted, added and subtracted, until the numbers stopped being numbers and became another kind of winter weather. He would make it to town when the road opened, if the old truck started, if the drifts weren't higher than the hood, if the county plow remembered the turnoff. He kept a running list of ifs to distract himself from the one he never said out loud, if I don't. The radio on the shelf above the pantry shelves was a stubborn thing. He turned the knob until the static softened and a voice broke through. The announcer spoke of school closures, of a church basement open as a warming center, of a lost hound found safe. There was talk of another system brewing, a phrase that landed in the room like a new weight on an already bowed beam. Earl turned the radio off before the forecast could become a sentence. He pulled on his coat and hat and opened the door to the porch. The wind slapped his face raw and clean. Snow had drifted against the steps and up across the porch boards in scalloped ridges like frozen waves. He shoveled a narrow path to the woodpile, each load thrown over the railing with a dull, close thud. The woodpile had sunk over the weeks, from a rib-high wall to a knee-high shrug. He kept his breath steady, the way he had learned to when there were more rows to hoe than daylight to hoe them. Beyond the yard, the hill dropped into a narrow hollow where a creek ran slow under a skin of ice. He could hear it if he listened, water, worrying its way past rock into the wide world. The sound was a promise he tried hard to believe. He gathered an armful of split oak, the smell of it rising warm and sweet in the cold air, and carried it inside. The door thunked closed, and the house exhaled around him. He set the new wood down, shook the snow from his hat, and stood for a moment with both hands on the back of his chair. The quiet returned, a living thing that moved from room to room. He poured hot water over coffee grounds in the dented kettle and waited until the smell climbed the air like a ladder. He poured the coffee black, no sugar, no cream, and took it to the window to watch the road you couldn't see. In the glass, his face floated like a ghost layered over the storm, stubble silvering his jaw, eyes a washed-out blue that had seen what work could make and unmake, a hat line carved into his forehead that never faded. Ruth used to trace that line with her finger and call it his mountain ridge. He touched it now and felt the two worlds press closer together, the one he could stand in and the one he could not. A hollow thump traveled along the porch, the kind a branch makes when it rolls in the wind. He listened, counted, decided it was nothing. The wind bullied the door, then let it alone. Somewhere in the ridge beyond the creek, a tree cracked under the weight of snow. The sound a rifle shot in the quiet, followed by a long sigh as it settled into its new truth. He wanted to tell Ruth about the sound, how it always made him feel both small and necessary, but the room wasn't taking stories today. He washed his bowl, dried it with the towel he kept on the back of the chair, and hung it on the nail by the stove. Order was a way to keep the wolves out, his father had said. He could hear the old man's voice as clearly as if he were sitting at the table with his hat in his hands. Earl had learned later the wolves his father meant weren't the ones that moved on four legs through the timber. He pulled a quilt around his shoulders and settled in the rocker beside the stove. The chair creaked, a friendly complaint that answered to no one. Outside, the light gave up early, as midwinter light does, and the world turned the color of pewter. Snow kept falling, steady and faithful. The stove's small window showed a slice of orange that breathed and then drew a long breath, as if gathering itself. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the wind run over him, east to west, up ridge to down. Sleep in such weather comes in shallow pools. He drifted, woke, drifted again. In one of the shallows he heard Ruth humming, the wordless tune she used to carry through the house when she was making bread or putting clean sheets on the bed, the sound of a life that fits. He opened his eyes to the dark and the soft glow of the stove and knew it had only been the storm, finding a melody. But for a heartbeat, the room felt full. When he woke for good, the window had gone from pewter to black, and the wind had sharpened its teeth. He rose stiffly, fed the fire, and checked the latch on the door. He stood there longer than the latch required, listening to the outer world strain at the boundary. Somewhere out in that dark, the road lay under a white drifted ocean. Somewhere beyond, a town was lit and buzzing, and someone was laughing in a way that made other people want to laugh too. He pictured it as a man will picture a country he once visited and may never see again. Back at the table, he folded his hands without meaning to and bent his head. He had never been much for church, but winter makes quiet believers of us all. He didn't ask for anything as specific as deliverance. He asked for the small mercy of a morning in which the stove would still be hot, the roof would still be above him, and the creek would still be talking to itself under the ice. He asked to be remembered by a world that had every right to forget. The wind eased for a moment, and in that small pocket of quiet, the house clicked wood shifting, nails thinking about their work. He could hear the tiniest tick of snowflakes meeting glass. He lifted his head and saw, without knowing why he noticed it, the faintest smudge at the edge of the porch light's reach, the kind of shape you make by rubbing your thumb across a window you've breathed on. It moved, or he thought it did, the way a shadow moves when the fire changes its mind. He told himself it was a branch, a tuft of grass, the snow itself learning to drift against what stood in its way. He did not go to the door. He had already counted his ifs for the day. He turned the chair to face the stove and settled again into the slow, steady rhythm that keeps a man on this side of midnight. He would check the porch in the morning. He would shovel a wider path and bring in more wood. He would try the radio again and turn the calendar page, not because it would change anything, but because Ruth would have liked him to. Snow fell. The creek kept its promise, quiet and sure. The wind sorted the trees and found no weakness left to exploit. When Earl finally eased into sleep, the last thing he heard was the old house breathing with him, the sound of a companion he had taken for granted until he found himself needing it more than he could say. Somewhere at the edge of the dark, the smudge moved again and then went still, like a held breath waiting for morning. The storm had not let up when Earl stirred awake, his chair groaning as he shifted. The fire had burned down to a low glow, its faint heat only a thin shield against the cold pressing in from the walls. He rubbed his chest, feeling the dull ache that had visited him often these last years, then rose to feed the stove. The house was quieter than usual, almost expectant, as though it, too, waited for something. A sudden thump rattled the porch. Earl froze, poker still in hand, listening hard. It came again, deliberate this time, heavier than falling snow or a stray branch. He set the poker down slowly, heart beating in his ears. Another thud followed, then a sound that made the hair rise along his neck, a sharp snort, muffled by the wind but undeniably alive. He shuffled to the door and pressed his palm against the cold wood, debating whether he should open it. Wolves had prowled these hills for generations, and though rare now, he had heard their cries just nights before. But this wasn't a howl, it was something bigger, heavier. Gathering his courage, Earl unlatched the door and pulled it open a crack. What he saw stopped his breath. Standing at the edge of the porch, half lost in the swirling snow, was a massive white horse. Its coat, though dulled by frost, gleamed in the lantern light like marble come to life. Beside it, pressed close, trembled two foals, their small frames barely able to resist the gusting wind. Their eyes were wide and black, reflecting the light with a fear that mirrored Earl's own. The mare lowered her head, a strand of snow-damp mane swinging across her face, and gave a low, urgent sound that felt less like a neigh and more like a plea. Earl gripped the doorframe, his knees weak. He hadn't seen a horse up close in years, not since he'd sold the last of his work animals when the land could no longer carry them. He blinked, convinced the storm was playing tricks on his mind. Yet the mare stamped her hoof, sending up a puff of snow, and the foals pressed tighter against her legs. They were no illusion. "You've lost your way, girl," he whispered, voice shaky. "What in the world are you doing out here?" The mare shifted, revealing a limp in her right foreleg. She took one careful step closer to the porch, eyes never leaving his. The foals followed clumsily, stumbling in the drifts. The sight clawed at something deep in Earl, a memory of Ruth carrying an abandoned puppy into the house years ago, her face set with determination. No creature should face the cold alone, she'd said, wrapping the pup in her apron. Earl's mouth went dry. He had so little left to give. The oats in the pantry were meant to last him, the firewood pile was shrinking, and he could barely stretch his strength through the days. Yet here stood this desperate family, waiting for his decision. He felt Ruth's absence like a hand on his shoulder, pressing him forward. "Lord help me," he muttered, stepping aside. "Come in, if you've a mind to." At first, the mare hesitated, her great frame silhouetted against the white chaos behind her. Then, as though understanding his words, she mounted the porch steps with surprising grace, each hoof striking the wood with a hollow weight. The foals scrambled after, slipping, then righting themselves. Together they filled the narrow porch, their steaming breath drifting like clouds around Earl's head. When he opened the door wider, the mare ducked her head and stepped through the threshold. The foals followed close, their hooves clicking against the worn planks of the cabin floor. Instantly the air changed. The room, once heavy with solitude, came alive with the earthy smell of animals, the sharp tang of wet hair, and the sound of soft snorts and shifting bodies. Earl shut the door quickly against the storm and turned to face his unexpected guests. The cabin seemed impossibly small now. The mare nearly brushed the ceiling beams, her muscles rippling with each cautious movement. The foals stuck tight to her sides, wide-eyed but curious, their small muzzles brushing the edge of the rug. Earl leaned against the door, struggling to take it all in. "You've gone mad, Earl Johnson," he muttered aloud, half to himself. "Inviting horses into your living room." The mare turned her head toward him then, eyes locking with his in a gaze so steady, so intelligent, it stilled his nervous laughter. She gave a quiet rumble in her chest and nudged one of the foals gently forward, as though to say, "See, we mean no harm." The younger of the two foals, braver than its sibling, tottered toward Earl. Its legs trembled, but it pressed its damp muzzle against his hand. The touch startled him, warm, soft, alive. Something in his chest cracked open. For the first time in years, the silence inside him lifted, replaced by a pulse of connection he hadn't thought possible. Without realizing it, he sank to one knee, resting a weathered hand on the foal's neck. "Easy, little one," he murmured. The words came unbidden, the same tone he'd once used to soothe Ruth when she woke from bad dreams, the same tone he'd used for calves born weak in the spring. His throat tightened. Behind him, the fire flared, throwing a glow across the cabin. Shadows danced on the log walls, and the snow outside seemed farther away, less suffocating. Earl rose slowly, his knees protesting, and shuffled toward the old chest near the hearth. He rummaged until he found a towel and a nearly forgotten tin of horse liniment from years gone by. "Guess you've chosen your fool," he said, glancing back at the mare. She stood patiently, waiting, her injured leg lifted slightly. Earl approached carefully, palms open, murmuring low. To his amazement, she didn't shy away when he touched her. The leg was swollen, the limp explained. He dabbed a bit of the liniment and wrapped it gently with the towel. "You'll need better than this," he sighed, "but it'll hold for tonight." The foals, encouraged by their mother's calm, began nosing around the cabin, sniffing chair legs, bumping into the small table, snorting at the iron kettle. Earl chuckled despite himself. "Careful now, that's all I've got left worth keeping." When he stepped back, the mare eased herself onto the braided rug before the fireplace, careful with her injured leg. The foals curled beside her, heads drooping with exhaustion. The firelight caught in their coats, turning them into figures carved from snow and silver. Earl lowered himself into his chair again, staring at the impossible scene before him. The storm raged on outside, but in here there was warmth, breath, and a heartbeat not his own echoing through the room. He rubbed his tired eyes, whispered, "Ruth, you'd call this a miracle." The mare blinked slowly, then closed her eyes as though in agreement. Earl leaned back, chest rising with a sigh that held more peace than he had known in years. For the first time since Ruth's death, he felt the cabin was no longer empty. By morning, the storm still hammered the cabin, relentless and howling, but inside the air had shifted. Earl woke to the sound of hooves shuffling against the wooden floor, a steady rhythm that felt strangely comforting. For a moment he thought he had dreamed the night before, but when he lifted his head from the chair back, there they were, the white mare resting on the braided rug, her two foals curled against her like patches of snow that had come alive. The cabin had never looked so small. The mare's massive body filled the main room almost wall to wall, her head nearly brushing the low beams above. The foals pressed close to her side, their tiny muzzles twitching as they dreamed. Earl blinked in disbelief at the sight of steam rising from their breath in the cold air of his living room. He pulled his quilt tighter around his shoulders and shook his head. "Well," he muttered, his voice rough, "looks like I've got company." The mare lifted her head at his voice, ears flicking forward, and gave a low sound in her throat. It wasn't a whinny, not quite, it was softer, closer to a hum. The foals stirred and blinked at him with wide, innocent eyes. Earl found himself chuckling, an unfamiliar sound in the cabin since Ruth's laughter had gone silent. He rose stiffly, his joints stiff with the cold, and the night spent in a chair, and went to the stove. The fire had dwindled to a few coals. He fed it carefully with split oak until the flames caught again, throwing warmth into the room. The horses turned toward the fire as if they knew its promise. The foals shifted, their legs tucked under them, and leaned into the heat with a sigh that filled the room like music. The smell of them was unmistakable: damp hair, earth, and the faint sweetness of hay, though Earl had none. It mingled with the smoke of the fire and the scent of beans that still lingered from the night before. The cabin, once so sterile in its loneliness, felt suddenly alive. Every corner seemed to hum with breath and movement. Earl crouched near the pantry and considered what little he had: a coffee can of oats for his morning porridge, a handful of withered carrots. The thought of parting with any of it made his stomach tighten, But when he looked back at the mare and her foals, the decision was made. He measured half of the oats into an old pot, added warm water, and set it on the stove. As the mixture thickened, he cut the carrots into small chunks. The foals, curious, lifted their heads and watched each slice fall with sharp attention. When he set the pot on the floor, the mare approached with caution, sniffed it once, then began to eat, her movements careful but desperate. The foals waited, hesitant until they saw her chewing, then edged forward and nibbled the carrot pieces with surprising eagerness. "There you go," Earl said softly, crouching beside them. "Not much, but it's yours." One foal nudged his hand with its nose, and for a moment Earl thought his chest might break from the warmth of it. His eyes stung, and he blinked hard, ashamed of how easily tears came now. The mare glanced up at him with an expression so intelligent, so steady, that he swore she understood. When they had eaten, the foals grew bold, exploring the room with clumsy steps. They sniffed at the rocking chair, nudged the leg of the table, and startled when they bumped against a stack of kindling that clattered to the floor. Earl laughed again, shaking his head. "You two are trouble already." The mare remained by the fire, stretching her injured leg carefully. Earl knelt again to check the bandage he had wrapped. It had slipped in the night, the makeshift knot loosening. With slow, deliberate hands, he retied it, speaking quietly as he worked. "This'll hold you for now, girl. We'll see about something better when the storm lets up." Her steady gaze met his, and she lowered her head slightly, as though acknowledging his effort. Earl felt a strange peace wash over him, as if the cabin itself had sighed in relief at their unlikely companionship. Outside, the wind howled like a chorus of wolves. Earl straightened, uneasy, and went to the window. Snow piled high against the glass, cutting off most of the light. The world beyond was gone, erased in white. He stood there for a long while, listening to the storm, but behind him came the sound of the foals chasing each other in small, playful bursts around their mother's legs. The sound of life in the middle of all that desolation. As the day passed, Earl busied himself with chores he'd nearly abandoned before. He chopped more wood, careful not to track too much snow inside, and filled the water bucket from the rain barrel half buried in drifts. Each time he stepped back into the cabin, the sight of the mare and foals greeted him like a hearth fire of its own. Their presence pulled him forward, gave him reason to keep moving. Toward evening, as the storm grew louder, he pulled his chair close to the fire. The foals lay together again, heads tucked under each other, while the mare dozed with her chin resting on her chest. Earl sat in silence, watching them breathe. The rhythm of it reminded him of Ruth, asleep beside him in years past, her breaths even and sure in the darkness. The memory was no longer a knife, but something gentler, a reminder of how it felt to belong. He reached for his Bible on the shelf, the one Ruth had read aloud from every Christmas. The leather cover was cracked, the pages thin from years of turning. He opened it at random and read quietly to himself, though his eyes often strayed to the white mare. Somehow the words felt less like ritual and more like truth in her presence. As night fell, the cabin settled into a strange, new harmony. Earl's loneliness, once an iron weight, eased into something lighter. He knew the storm would last for days, knew his food was already too little, but as he watched the mare lift her head and glance at him with calm, dark eyes, he realized he no longer feared the silence. The foals shifted in their sleep, the mare lowered her head onto her forelegs, and the fire popped with sparks. Earl whispered, almost without knowing he spoke, "Ruth, I think I'll be all right tonight." Then he leaned back in his chair, the warmth of 3 beating hearts filling the narrow room like a promise. The night pressed down on the cabin with a weight that felt alive. Earl had grown accustomed to the storm's voice, the constant shuffle of snow against wood, the moan of wind through the cracks. But tonight, there was something else in it, a sharpness, a warning note that made the horses restless. The mare lifted her head suddenly, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Her foals scrambled closer to her flanks, trembling as though the shadows themselves had teeth. Earl set aside the kettle he was warming and moved quietly to the window. The frost on the glass made the outside world little more than a blur of gray and white. Still, beyond the storm's roar, he thought he heard it, a high, mournful cry that rose and fell across the hills. It cut straight through the walls, straight through his bones. A wolf's call, long, hungry, and too close. He felt his stomach tighten. Wolves were not as common as they had been in his boyhood, but when hunger drove them down from the ridges, nothing could keep them away. He remembered stories from his father lean winters, when men carried shotguns to the barn every evening and prayed their stock would still be alive by morning. The mare shifted uneasily, her massive body blocking the foals from the door. She gave a deep snort, a sound of defiance, but there was fear in her eyes too. Earl reached for the old rifle that had leaned against the corner for years. The stock was scarred, the barrel worn, but he knew it would fire if he asked it to. He ran his thumb along the cool metal, not eager but resigned. "Not tonight," he muttered. "Not while I'm still breathing." Another howl answered, closer this time, followed by a chorus of yips and cries that carried across the frozen hollow. The foals whimpered softly, pressing tighter to their mother. Earl laid another log on the fire, trying to drown the sound with the crackle of flames, but the wolves' voices pierced everything. He lit the lantern and carried it to the porch, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The light swung wildly as the wind yanked at it, throwing shadows that writhed across the snow. There, at the far edge of the yard, he saw movement, dark shapes gliding low against the white. Eyes flashed like embers. He counted at least 4, maybe 5. Too many. Earl shut the door quickly, the latch rattling in his hand. He leaned against the wood, heart pounding, then glanced back at the mare. She stood tall despite her limp, her breath rising in clouds, her gaze fixed on the door as if she could see right through it. Earl lowered the rifle but kept it ready. He knew he couldn't fight off a whole pack alone. The wolves circled for hours. Their cries rose and fell, sometimes fading into the trees, only to return sharper, closer. Once, a heavy thud struck the outside wall, one of them leaping, testing. The foals squealed and stumbled back, and Earl found himself whispering to them like frightened children. "Hush now, you're safe here. I won't let them take you." Time stretched. The fire burned low again, and Earl fed it with trembling hands, refusing to let the light die. His breath rasped in the silence between howls. He had not felt so responsible for another life since Ruth's final days, when every breath she took had felt like a weight in his own chest. That same helpless devotion washed over him now. He could not fail these creatures, not after he'd opened the door. At last, near dawn, the voices faded. The hills grew quiet except for the groan of the wind. Earl sagged into his chair, the rifle across his lap, exhaustion pulling at every muscle. The foals crept forward cautiously, their small heads pressing against his knee as if to reassure themselves that he was real, that he was still there. The mare lowered her head too, resting it briefly against the back of his chair. The gesture was so human it made his throat ache. "Guess we all made it," he whispered, voice breaking. Outside, the snow piled higher, covering tracks, covering the memory of teeth in the night. Inside, the cabin felt changed. It wasn't only shelter now, it was a fortress, a sanctuary bound by the simple decision of one man not to turn away. Earl stroked the foal's soft mane, realizing with a shiver that he had crossed a line. Whatever came next, he was tied to them now. Their survival and his were one. By the third morning, the storm's roar had softened to a steady whisper, though drift still swallowed the yard fence and leaned high against the barn ruins. Earl rose from his chair, bones stiff, and pulled on his boots. The cabin was still thick, with the smell of animals' damp fur, wood smoke, and the faint tang of liniment on the mare's leg. The foals were awake and curious, tugging at the edges of a quilt he had draped across a chair. He waved them off gently, muttering under his breath, but a smile ghosted his lips. The day's quiet was broken by a sound Earl hadn't heard in nearly a week, the sputter of an engine fighting its way up the snow-packed track. His stomach clenched before he even looked out the window. Only one man in the hollow drove a truck that loud. Frank Miller. Earl swore softly and went to the door. The sound grew louder until the truck ground to a halt in front of the cabin, wheels spinning before finding grip. Frank climbed out, a bulky figure in a heavy coat and hat pulled low. He stomped through the snow with the air of a man who believed every piece of land within sight belonged to him. "Morning, Earl," Frank bellowed before Earl could greet him. His breath rose in great plumes as he slapped his gloves together. "Heard the storm hit you hard up here. Figured I'd check if you were still alive." "I manage," Earl said flatly. He stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him just enough to muffle the sounds of hooves inside. His pulse quickened. If Frank so much as glimpsed the horses, there'd be no end to his questions. Frank leaned against the porch post, scanning the yard. His eyes narrowed at the drifted snow, at tracks half hidden but unmistakable. Large hoofprints leading up to the steps. "You've had visitors," he said casually, though his gaze was sharp. Earl's mouth went dry. "Just the storm," he said. Snow'll make tracks of its own if you stare long enough. Frank chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly sound. Funny thing, radio down in town says some fella from Charleston lost himself a string of fine white horses. Got loose in the first storm. There's a reward, big one. You hear about that? No? Earl lied. He shifted his weight, wishing Frank would stop peering past him. Frank spat into the snow, the dark stains spreading like ink. Well, you'd best keep your eyes open. Folks would pay good money for animals like that. Could fix a lot of problems for a man short on cash. His eyes lingered on Earl a moment too long. Earl gripped the doorframe until his knuckles whitened. You know me, Frank. Not much left here worth stealing. That's what I figured. Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. Still, if you see anything unusual, you might want to let me know. Be a shame if somebody else claimed that prize. The wind cut between them, cold and sharp. Earl kept his jaw tight, refusing to rise to the bait. At last Frank tipped his hat and turned back toward his truck. The engine coughed, belched black smoke, and slowly carried him down the track, tires chewing through snow. Only when the sound faded did Earl push back inside. The mare was on her feet, ears pricked, her foals tucked close behind her. She had felt the tension even through the walls. Earl set the rifle against the table and sank into his chair, shaking his head. That man smells trouble like a hound, he muttered. He reached out, running his palm down the mare's neck. She leaned into the touch, her strength a quiet reassurance. The foals crept closer, nosing at his boots as though they, too, sensed his unease. Earl stared into the fire, his mind turning heavy. Frank was the kind to follow a scent until he cornered it. If he came back, if he brought others, the secret of these horses wouldn't hold long. But looking at them, the way the mare shielded her young, the way the foals pressed to him for comfort, he knew one thing with certainty. He would not hand them over. Not for Frank. Not for a reward. Not for anything. Outside, the snow whispered down again, covering the tracks in the yard. Earl prayed it would cover suspicion too, but in his gut he knew Frank would return. Trouble had already found its trail. The night after Frank's visit was colder than any Earl could remember. The stove groaned under the weight of the logs he fed it, and still the frost crept down. The inside of the windows like spider webs of ice. Every gust of wind rattled the walls, each one sounding like the hollow knuckles of fate knocking at his door. Earl sat close to the fire, rubbing his hands together until the skin chafed red. The mare lay stretched across the rug, her foals tucked close against her flank, their steady breathing filling the silence. He envied them their peace. His own chest felt tight, each breath like dragging a bucket up from the bottom of a well. He shifted in his chair, trying to will the ache away, but the pain came sudden and sharp, a fist squeezing around his heart. His bowl of beans clattered to the floor as he doubled over, gasping, his vision blurred. He reached for the arm of the chair but slid to the floor, the rifle clattering against the wall. The foals startled awake, squealing softly. The mare rose with surprising swiftness for her size, despite the limp, and moved to stand over him. Earl clutched at his chest, wheezing, certain this was the end. But then something extraordinary happened. The mare bent her great head, pressing her warm muzzle firmly against his ribs. One foal nuzzled against his hand, the other pressed its tiny chest against his side. Heat surged through him, real, undeniable, not from the fire but from them. The pressure in his chest eased as though invisible hands had pried it open. His breaths came easier, slower. He blinked, tears leaking down his temples, staring up at the rafters blurred with smoke and shadow. You saved me," he whispered hoarsely. The mare lifted her head, eyes reflecting the firelight, and snorted softly as if to answer. Earl lay there for a long time, trembling not just from the aftermath of pain, but from the realization that he was no longer fighting alone. Something beyond his understanding had taken hold in this cabin. When at last he pulled himself upright with the help of the chair, the foals followed, pressing close, their muzzles brushing against his arm. He stroked their necks with shaking hands, overwhelmed by a tenderness he had thought buried with Ruth. Later, after he had cleaned the spilled beans and steadied himself, Earl sat again by the fire. The mare settled near his feet, her head resting on the hearth's edge, her eyes half-lidded but watchful. The foals curled beside her, already drifting back to sleep. Earl stared into the flames, feeling his heartbeat slow to a rhythm he could trust. He thought of Ruth, then not of her last days in the hospital, but of her laughter, her strong hands, the way she always believed animals carried a wisdom men were too proud to see. She had told him once, during a summer storm, that the world sends us what we need if only we stop to notice. He had scoffed at the time, but now, with the mare's steady breath filling the cabin, he wondered if she had been right all along. The night wore on. Earl dozed lightly, waking now and then to the crackle of the fire, to the soft snorts of the foals as they dreamed. Each time he woke, the ache in his chest was gone, replaced by a calm that felt like borrowed strength. When dawn finally broke pale and weak across the hills, Earl rose with it, feeling more alive than he had in years. He fed the fire, boiled water for coffee, and cut what remained of his bread into 3 pieces. The mare and her foals watched him, patient and trusting. He set the bread before them and smiled at their eager chewing. For the first time since Ruth's passing, Earl felt the fragile outline of hope. He reached for the old Bible again, flipping until his eyes landed on a verse about burdens shared and yokes made light. He laughed quietly to himself. "Guess you 3 are my yoke now." The mare flicked her ears as though she agreed. Outside, the wind carried the faint cry of wolves again, but Earl no longer felt powerless. He had seen what these creatures could do not just to his body, but to his soul. He closed his eyes, pressing a hand to his chest, whispering into the silence, "I'm not done yet, not while you're here." The morning after his collapse dawned quiet, the sky a dull pewter lid pressed against the mountains. Earl woke slowly, half afraid the pain in his chest would return with the day, but he found only a deep soreness, the echo of something fierce that had passed. The mare was standing near the hearth, her foals still asleep at her side, their small bodies rising and falling in unison. The sight filled him with a fragile calm, yet under it lay a question that had gnawed at him through the long night. Why here? Why me? As he set about feeding the fire and boiling water for oats, his gaze fell on the old chest tucked beneath the stairs. It had sat there for years, gathering dust, heavy with the weight of memories he had avoided. The chest had been Ruth's pride, carved by his own hands as a wedding gift decades ago. He hadn't opened it since the day he closed it after her funeral, locking away not just quilts and keepsakes but his own heart. The mare lifted her head as if she, too, noticed his stare. Earl set his spoon down, drawn to the chest with a reluctance that made his hands shake. Kneeling, he brushed dust from the lid and ran his palm across the scarred surface. The key still hung from a nail above the doorframe, right where Ruth had left it. He hesitated, then pulled it down. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the cabin. Inside, the chest smelled faintly of cedar and lavender sachets long faded. Neatly folded quilts lay on top, their colors muted with age. Beneath them, tucked between a stack of books and an old shawl, he found a leather-bound journal. He knew it instantly, Ruth's handwriting, the careful loops of her name etched on the inside cover. His throat tightened as he traced the familiar scrawl. He carried it to the table, sat down, and opened to the first page he dared. The ink was faint in places, but the words were alive with her voice. "I dream again of the horses, white as snow, with eyes like lanterns. They come not as beasts, but as messengers. I tell Earl, but he only shakes his head and calls it fancy. Perhaps he is right. Still, I feel they are waiting, somewhere in the folds of the hills, biding their time until he needs them most." Earl's breath caught. His hand trembled as he turned another page. Last night the dream was sharper. The mare stood in a storm, her 2 foals pressed against her. She looked at me and said nothing, but I understood. She would find him when he was alone, when the world was too heavy. She promised. The room swam. He pressed his palm against the journal to steady it. His eyes lifted to the mare standing by the fire, watching him with that same unwavering gaze Ruth had described. The foals stirred, blinking sleepily, as though summoned by the words on the page. "It can't be," Earl whispered. His voice cracked against the silence. The mare shifted, her injured leg bent awkwardly, but her head dipped in a slow, deliberate motion that sent shivers down his spine. He closed the journal, pressing it to his chest as though he could hold Ruth's voice inside him. Memories surged, her laughter on the porch in summer, her hand warm in his during the long winters, her faith in things unseen. She had tried to tell him, he had not listened. The day passed with Earl moving in a haze. He repaired the mare's bandage again, speaking softly as he worked, though his mind replayed the journal's words over and over. He shared his meager food with the foals, watching them nibble eagerly, and every bite they took felt like a link in a chain binding him closer to Ruth. By evening, when the storm outside had grown wild again, Earl returned to the journal. He read until the fire dimmed and shadows reached across the room. Ruth's later entries were harder to bear. He grows quieter each day. The loneliness sits heavy on him, though he won't admit it. I fear for him. After I am gone, I ask the horses in my dreams to keep their promise. They nod as if they hear me. Earl closed the book with a trembling sigh. He sat back in his chair, tears blurring his vision, the journal still pressed to his chest. The mare approached then, silent on the wooden floor, and lowered her head until her muzzle brushed the cover. Earl froze, staring into her eyes, certain for one impossible moment that Ruth was looking back at him through them. "Did she send you?" His voice cracked like old timber. The mare exhaled, warm breath rushing across his hands. Earl felt the last of his disbelief crack, leaving something new in its place: awe, fear, and a hope he had not dared in years. That night he lay awake in his chair, the journal resting on the table beside him. The foals slept, the mare kept her silent vigil, and the storm sang around the cabin. Earl's world had shifted. He was no longer a man hiding from grief. He was a man standing in the center of a promise Ruth had made long ago. By late afternoon, the sky thickened again, a gray wall rolling over the peaks with a heaviness that made Earl's stomach twist. He had learned to read the weather in the folds of the land, and this sky meant trouble. The air felt raw, sharp as broken glass, and the stillness before the storm was almost worse than the storm itself. Even the foals seemed to sense it, darting nervously around the cabin, bumping into table legs, then pressing themselves close to their mother when the wind carried the first low moan across the ridge. Earl had been mending a split in the mare's bandage, but he paused, eyes on the window where snowflakes already slapped against the glass. "Another one," he murmured. "As if the last storm didn't nearly bury us alive." The mare shifted her weight uneasily, ears flicking. She let out a deep sound that seemed both warning and reassurance. Earl rose stiffly and stoked the fire, but his mind had already leapt ahead. What of the barn? The sagging roof hadn't been touched since last winter's damage. If the wind tore at it, if the weight of snow broke it further, the wreck could tumble right against the cabin itself. He bundled into his coat, tugged his boots on, and braced against the door. "Stay put," he told the horses, though he knew they couldn't understand. The foals whickered anxiously as he stepped into the storm. The world outside had turned into a wall of white. Snow drove sideways, slicing his cheeks raw. Earl leaned into it, forcing each step through drifts that caught at his knees. The barn loomed like a wounded animal, half collapsed, its timbers groaning as the wind seized them. He waded closer, heart hammering. A loud crack split the air, followed by the groan of wood under strain. "Hold together, just a little longer," he muttered, though the barn had long since stopped listening. He tried pulling at a half-fallen beam, hoping to wedge it upright, but his strength failed him. The storm swallowed his grunts, laughed at his effort, and threw another blast that sent snow stinging into his eyes. Then the roof gave way. It happened all at once, the sharp scream of nails ripping free, the thunderous crash as a section of roof folded inward. Snow and splinters exploded into the air, and Earl was thrown backward into the drift. For a long moment he lay stunned, the storm's roar filling his ears, until the sting of cold forced him upright again. He stared at the barn, now broken further, one wall sagging dangerously toward the cabin. If the collapse spread, it could drag the rest down, crush the yard, and block the only path to the creek. Panic surged in his chest, but another sound cut through it, a frantic neigh. Earl turned, horrified, to see that the mare had forced the cabin door open with her shoulder. She stood half in the doorway, the foals pressed against her legs, calling to him with wild eyes. Snow swirled around her white coat, making her look like some spirit risen out of the storm. "Get back inside," Earl shouted, stumbling toward her, but the mare refused to retreat. She whinnied again, sharp and commanding. Earl felt the pull in his chest. It wasn't just an animal's call. It was as if she demanded he return to safety. He staggered up the steps, nearly falling, and shoved her back inside. The foals bolted past him, frightened but unhurt. He slammed the door, bracing his back against it while the wind rattled the frame. His lungs burned with cold, and his heart thumped hard, but he was alive, barely. Inside, the cabin seemed smaller than ever, pressed in by the weight of the storm and the knowledge of what had nearly happened. The mare snorted, shaking snow from her mane. She looked at him, steady and fierce, as if scolding him for risking himself. Earl sank into the chair, chest heaving, and managed a hoarse laugh. All right, you were right," Foolman shouldn't fight a storm alone. The foals circled restlessly, still jittery from the noise outside. Earl leaned forward, rubbing their necks until they settled. The warmth of their bodies seeped into his hands, chasing out the chill. He whispered, "We're all still here. That's what matters." Hours dragged. Each crash of the storm sent tremors through the cabin. Snow sifted in through cracks, and Earl stuffed rags into the gaps as best he could. The roof creaked, timbers groaning like tired men, but it held. The barn, though he could hear pieces of it giving way, the dull thud of collapsing wood carried by the wind, every sound made him wince. The place he had once built with Ruth's help, the pride of his farm, was coming apart beam by beam. By midnight the storm reached its height. Earl sat awake by the fire, rifle across his knees, though he knew it would do nothing against wind and snow. The mare stood guard at the door, her injured leg trembling but her head held high. The foals slept, exhausted, their sides rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The sight gave him courage. When at last the storm began to weaken, Earl rose stiffly and cracked the door open. The world beyond looked like a battlefield, drifts piled higher than his waist, the barn half buried, its roof scattered across the yard. The silence after the storm was almost worse than its fury. He closed the door gently and returned to the fire. The mare stepped forward then, lowering her head until it rested lightly against his shoulder. Earl closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion and gratitude washing over him. "We'll rebuild," he whispered. "One way or another, we'll make it through." The cabin creaked around them, worn but still standing, and in that moment Earl realized that while the storm had broken his barn, it had not broken him. The presence of these horses, this unexpected family, had given him something he hadn't felt in years, the will to fight on. The storm had barely passed when Earl heard the grind of tires against ice. His heart sank before he even reached the window. Sure enough, Frank Miller's truck crept up the track, exhaust coughing into the brittle air. Earl muttered a curse under his breath. Trouble had returned, just as he feared. He stepped outside before Frank could rap on the door. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the cold biting his lungs. Frank climbed down from his truck, bundled thick in sheepskin, his eyes sharp and restless. He looked over the wreckage of the barn, then at Earl's drawn face. "Barn didn't hold," Frank said, his tone halfway between sympathy and smugness. "Storm sure took a toll. You'll never patch that heap together." "I'll manage," Earl answered, jaw tight. He kept the door closed behind him, though he could almost feel the mare's presence inside, her watchful gaze burning through the wood. Frank shoved his hands deep in his pockets, rocking on his heels. "Funny thing, folks down valley been talking. That reward for those white horses doubled, maybe even tripled. Word is, the fella's desperate to get 'em back. Purebred stock, worth more than your whole spread ever was." Earl's stomach knotted. He forced his voice steady. "What's that got to do with me?" "Tracks," Frank said simply. He gestured toward the yard, where snow half covered the evidence of hooves. "I saw 'em last time. Now the storms laid new ones, clear as Sunday writing. Big mare, 2 foals. Can't miss it." Earl's pulse pounded in his ears. "Wild herd," he said. "Plenty of strays in these hills." Frank grinned without humor. "Don't play me for a fool. You've got something tucked away, and I mean to see it." He took a step toward the door. Earl moved instinctively, planting himself in front of it. "You're not welcome past this porch." The two men stood locked in silence, the wind whistling around them. Frank's eyes narrowed. "You'd turn down a chance at $10,000? You could fix that barn, put food in your pantry, buy yourself a decent truck. Don't tell me you'd rather starve than hand over a few animals." "They're not mine to give," Earl said. His voice came out low but steady, like the crack of an axe in winter wood. Frank let out a sharp laugh. "Everything's got a price, Earl. Always has." He tried to shoulder past, but Earl caught his arm with surprising strength. "Not this time." For a moment Frank stared at him, surprise flickering across his face at the steel in Earl's grip. Then his expression hardened. "You'll regret crossing me." He yanked his arm free and stalked back to the truck, boots crunching, shoulders hunched. The engine roared to life, tires spitting slush as he sped down the track. Earl stood watching until the truck disappeared beyond the bend. Only then did he sag against the porch rail, his breath coming heavy. When he finally went back inside, the mare was standing tall in the center of the room, her foals huddled at her side. Her ears flicked forward as he entered, as though she had understood every word spoken on the porch. "They know," Earl said hoarsely, sinking into his chair. "And they'll be back, but I won't let them take you." The mare stepped closer, lowering her head until her muzzle brushed his shoulder. The foals pressed against his legs, their warmth seeping into him like a vow. For the first time in years, Earl felt something fierce stir in his chest, not just survival, but defiance. That night he lay awake by the fire, rifle propped within reach, listening to the quiet hills. The storm had passed, but another kind of danger prowled now. Wolves had fangs, but men like Frank had sharper teeth. Earl knew the coming days would test him in ways he had long tried to avoid. Yet as the mare stood guard and the foals breathed steady at his feet, he also knew this. He was no longer alone in the fight. The morning after Frank's threat dawned in silence. The storm had scoured the mountains clean, leaving the landscape sharp and blinding under the pale Sunday. Snow glistened like crushed glass, each drift carved into ridges by the wind. Earl opened the cabin door carefully, wary of more trouble, and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit hard at his skin, but the air carried a brightness that felt different, like the world itself had been reset overnight. The mare emerged behind him, limping slightly but strong enough to follow. Her white coat shimmered against the endless whiteness, so that for a moment she seemed a part of it, a spirit carved from snow and sky. The foals bounded after her, playful despite the cold, their small hooves scattering frost into the air. Earl watched them with a mix of awe and dread. He knew they didn't belong here, not in the ordinary sense, yet he couldn't imagine the cabin without them now. He trudged to the barn's remains, the mare trailing him. The collapse had left beams splintered, half buried beneath snow. He sifted through the wreckage, pulling away broken planks, his breath puffing in clouds. His body ached, but work gave him focus. As he strained at a fallen beam, he felt a warmth at his side. The mare had stepped forward, pressing her shoulder against the timber. With a heave that startled him, she shifted the weight enough for him to drag it aside. Earl staggered back, panting, staring at her. "You helping me now, girl?" She tossed her head, snorting, then pawed at the snow as though urging him to keep going. And he did. Together they cleared enough debris to carve out a sheltered corner, a patch of floor still solid beneath the wreckage. The foals trotted in circles, carrying bits of straw in their mouths, as if mimicking the work. Earl laughed aloud, the sound bursting from him without warning. "You're a fine crew," he said. "Better company than most men I've known." By midday he had created a space that could hold against the elements. It wasn't much bare walls reinforced with tarps he found in a chest, a patch of roof lashed with rope, but it was enough for the mare and foals to stretch without crowding the cabin. As he leaned against a post, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold, he realized he felt stronger than he had in years. His chest ached, yes, but the kind of ache that came from labor well spent, not from illness. When they returned to the cabin, Earl fixed a thin stew of beans and what little flour he had left. He ate sparingly, giving more to the foals than himself, though his stomach growled in protest. The mare nudged his shoulder as he sat back, almost as if scolding him for his sacrifice. He smiled wearily. "Don't worry about me. You three are the reason I've got breath left in me." That night, something remarkable happened. The foals, restless with energy, began to prance in front of the fire. At first Earl thought it was play, but then he noticed the rhythm of their movements, hooves lifting in time, bodies swaying with uncanny grace. It was like watching a dance, not taught, but born from instinct. The firelight caught their coats, and they gleamed like spirits. The mare watched them, then turned her gaze on Earl. He felt something stir inside him, as though a locked door had been thrown wide. His grief, long a crushing weight, eased in that moment. He saw Ruth's face in the flames, not sick and fading, but young and laughing, her hands raised in applause. Earl's throat tightened. "You're showing me something, aren't you?" he whispered. "You're trying to wake me up." He lowered his head into his hands, the sound of his sobs swallowed by the crackle of fire. For years he had lived half dead, dragging his body through days that felt endless. Now, in the presence of these creatures, something inside him stirred back to life. It was terrifying and wondrous all at once. When he finally looked up, the mare had settled beside his chair. She lowered her great head onto his knee, her eyes meeting his with a depth that shook him. He placed a trembling hand on her muzzle, and for the first time since Ruth's death, he felt a peace that did not fade with the morning light. Outside, the stars burned cold and endless. Inside, Earl sat surrounded by warmth, by breath, by life. Something had changed in him that could not be undone. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living again. When the county plows finally cut through the main road, the hollow stirred back to life. Radios buzzed again with local chatter. The post office opened its door, and news of a community supper spread like wildfire through the valley. It was to be held at the church hall, the first gathering since the string of storms. Earl heard it from Maggie, the woman who kept the store in town, her voice crackling over the radio. "Come, Earl. Folks miss seeing you. Bring yourself back among us." He almost said no. For 3 years he had slipped quietly past invitations, hiding in his cabin, as though the world had no claim on him anymore. The thought of sitting at a crowded table, of being asked questions he couldn't answer, set his stomach to knots. But that evening, as he wrestled with doubt, the mare nudged him in the back with her great head, nearly shoving him off balance. Her foals stared with wide, unblinking eyes, as though waiting for his decision. All right, Earl muttered, chuckling despite himself. "I'll go, but don't expect me to smile much." The day of the supper, he washed his beard, trimmed it with shaking hands, and pulled on the flannel shirt Ruth had once mended so carefully. He glanced in the mirror and barely recognized himself, older, worn, but steadier. Before leaving, he stepped into the barn where the horses stood in their patched corner. "You three behave while I'm gone," he said. The foals nickered softly, and the mare bowed her head as if granting permission. The church hall was warm and bright, filled with the hum of voices and the clatter of dishes. The scent of roasted chicken, cornbread, and apple pies filled the air. Conversations paused briefly when Earl stepped in, the recluse who had been little more than a rumor these past years. Then Maggie's face lit up, and she hurried over. "You came," she said, gripping his hands. "I'm glad." Earl's throat tightened. "Didn't figure I'd be much missed." "Nonsense," Maggie said, guiding him toward the long tables. "We've all been waiting." Neighbors greeted him, some awkwardly, others with warmth. Children darted between legs, carrying plates piled high. Earl sat down beside folks he hadn't spoken to since Ruth's funeral. At first the noise overwhelmed him, but slowly he began to loosen. He even found himself laughing at Tom Jenkins's story about a cow that had broken into his wife's kitchen. When Maggie asked how he had weathered the storm, Earl hesitated. He could not tell them the truth, not about the mare who healed his chest with her breath, or the foals who danced by firelight. So he spoke carefully, saying only, "I wasn't alone." The words carried more weight than anyone realized. As the evening wore on, Maggie leaned close. "It's good to see you living again," she said softly. Earl lowered his eyes, feeling the ring that hung on a chain under his shirt. "I think Ruth would want it this way," he whispered. The supper ended with neighbors clasping his hand, inviting him to future gatherings, offering help to mend his barn. Earl accepted each kindness with a humility he had nearly forgotten. The warmth of human voices filled the hollow space inside him that even the storms had not touched. When he drove home under the starlit sky, he felt something new, a thread tying him back to the valley, to the people who had once been his world. As he crested the last ridge, his cabin came into view, a faint glow seeping from its windows. But what stopped him cold was the barn. Light poured from its cracks, soft and golden, too bright to be lantern flame. He parked the truck, heart pounding, and trudged through the snow. The night was still, the stars sharp above, but the barn shimmered as though something inside radiated from another world. Earl pressed his hand to the door, breath clouding the air. Behind it, he heard the soft stamping of hooves, the rustle of straw, and something else, a presence that made his skin prickle and his heart race. He whispered into the night, "Ruth?" The glow brightened, spilling around the edges of the door, beckoning him inside. The snow crunched beneath Earl's boots as he crossed the yard, the cold sharp enough to cut through his coat. His breath came in quick clouds, his pulse racing faster than it had in years. The glow spilling from the cracks of the old barn pulsed softly, like the heartbeat of some hidden giant. Every instinct told him to turn back, but something stronger, a pull he could not name, drew him forward. When he eased the door open, the world inside was transformed. The shattered timbers and sagging beams remained, but they shimmered with a golden sheen, as if the storm-worn wood had been polished by light itself. Straw on the floor glowed like spun gold, and at the center stood the mare and her foals, their white coats gleaming brighter than he had ever seen. They were not alone. A woman stood beside them, tall and slender, her hair silver as moonlight cascading over her shoulders. She wore a simple white dress, untouched by the cold, her bare feet resting on the straw as though it were velvet. Her eyes found Earl immediately, and in them he saw something that stole his breath recognition. "Welcome home, Earl," she said, her voice melodic, carrying warmth that filled the barn more than any fire could. His throat tightened. "Who are you?" "A messenger," she answered gently. "A bridge between what was and what island. I've come because you are ready." The foals pranced lightly at her side, their movements playful, yet reverent. The mare stood tall, her gaze steady on Earl, as though urging him to listen. "I don't understand," he whispered. The woman stepped closer, her presence neither ghost nor flesh, but something between. "Ruth asked that you not be left to fade alone. She dreamed of the white horses long before they came, and when the time was right, they found you. They are not just creatures of flesh, they are guardians, healers, reminders of what love leaves behind." At the sound of Ruth's name, Earl felt his knees weaken. She knew. "She knew you would need them," the woman said softly, "and she knew you would need proof that her love did not end with her breath." Earl's eyes burned. He swayed forward, resting a hand against a beam to steady himself. "But why me? I've wasted years. I shut the world out. I let the farm rot. I gave up." The mare stepped forward then, her head lowering until her muzzle pressed against his chest, right where the pain had once nearly claimed him. Warmth surged through him again, fierce and undeniable. The woman smiled. "Because even in your grief you chose compassion. You opened your door to them when you could have turned away. That was enough. That was everything." Earl let out a sob that broke into a laugh, the sound raw but freeing. The foals trotted up to him, nudging his hands, their soft muzzles urging him to kneel. When he did, the mare rested her head over his shoulder. For the first time since Ruth's passing, Earl did not feel alone. The woman reached out, touching his arm lightly. "They will stay as long as you need them, and when you are strong enough to stand without them, they will move on to another soul who has lost their way. That is their purpose." Earl swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Then let them stay. I still need them." The woman's smile deepened. In her face he glimpsed something fleeting, Ruth's warmth, Ruth's knowing eyes. "You are already healing, Earl. That is her gift to you." The golden light pulsed once more, then slowly dimmed until the barn was only a barn again, patched, broken, but real. The woman was gone, leaving behind only the steady presence of the horses. Earl knelt in the straw, tears streaking his face, his heart pounding not with pain but with life. He rose at last, brushing straw from his knees, and looked at the mare. "Thank you," he whispered. She snorted softly, her eyes glowing in the dim lantern light, and nudged him toward the door. Outside, the night was crisp and starlit. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains blanketed in fresh snow, each ridge gleaming under the moon like silver cloth. Earl stood in the stillness, his breath steady, his spirit lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, he did not dread the morning. He returned to the cabin with the foals bounding around him, their joy infectious. The mare followed, her steps strong despite the old limp. Earl paused on the porch, looking back at the barn. It no longer seemed broken to him, it seemed like a place of promise. Inside, he settled into his chair, the fire crackling low, the foals curling by the hearth. The mare stood close, her head near his shoulder. Earl reached for Ruth's journal on the table and opened it to the last page she had written. His eyes blurred as he read her words again. They will come when he needs them most. He closed the book gently and smiled. "You were right, Ruth. You always were." The firelight danced across the walls. The warmth of living beings filled the room, and Earl Johnson, poor farmer, widower, and once broken man, knew the truth. He had been given a second chance, not through wealth or miracles of man, but through love that had refused to die. And in that knowledge, he felt alive again. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. Just type 0 if you believe love can return in unexpected ways, or 1 if you think the white horses were truly a miracle. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story, each one more moving than the last, where people and animals remind us what it means to be alive.